Hi, everybody. I am Mark Graban, the VP of Improvement and Innovation Services for KaiNexus. I'd like to welcome you to episode 16 of Ask Us Anything.
Hello, and I'm Greg Jacobson. I'm the CEO and co-founder. And Mark, I am even more excited about this Ask Us Anything than the prior one.
Why is that? And I don't know.
The questions keep rolling in, one. And two, we had our first time where one of the questions actually came from one of the team members here at KaiNexus, and it was a great question. So I'm just excited all around.
All right, well, good. Well, good. So we are going to talk a lot about culture change, lean, continuous improvement, leadership, things like that. We always, there are questions in the anything realm of Ask Us Anything. It's college football season. Greg, do you have a favorite college football team? You're in Austin. Is it UT?
Yeah. No, it's interesting. If I had to answer what my favorite college football team is, it'd probably be the San Antonio Spurs. I mean, that's the first thing that comes to mind. I don't know. What about you, Mark?
The Northwestern Wildcats, which is my alma mater and my favorite team. They are only 3-3 this season, but I hope they're going to turn things around. Now, you went to undergrad Wash U, right?
Wash U.
Division III football team?
I believe they do. I sadly never attended a football game, or I don't even think a sporting event during my 4 years there. Academics and having fun was far more focused on, although the female volleyball team apparently is a powerhouse and wins national championships there all the time.
All right. Well, so I'm sure there's a lot of leadership and a strong culture there in that program. So let's go ahead and get into. There's a couple of questions I'm going to just combine.
Okay.
Denise, Chuck, and Tatanisha asked a couple of questions. How do you integrate the culture in a change-resistant environment? What are some best practices for shifting the culture in an organization? And then Chuck asked, how do you deal with culture change? Because lean is a new way of doing business. People have to change their ways to become process people, problem solvers. Top management has to come out from behind their desks to work with people. This is a big paradigm shift in any organization. Culture change must be addressed before any lean tools can be used effectively. So there's a lot we can kind of unravel there. What are your first thoughts, Greg, on let's say, resistance to change?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of sentences here. The one that just jumped out at me was, how do you deal with culture change? And I would say, hopefully well. Hopefully I deal with it well, but I know that that's not what I was really asking. I think what we oftentimes think of is that culture is something that you can build, like a building. I'm going to go get some 2x4s and this and that, and then all of a sudden we're going to have the culture right. But what we need to remember is that culture is just a manifestations of all the behaviors of the people in the organization, right? So that you can't. It's an illogical sentence to say, well, we're not going to start improving until we have a better culture. Well, no, actually, the way you develop a continuous improvement culture is by doing the action of improving. So, I mean, that's what jumps out in my mind right off the bat. I don't know, Mark, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, something I've been writing about. I talked about it in one of our KaiNexus webinars. This idea of this label that I'm kind of uncomfortable with. People say, oh, others are being resistant to change. I think the first thing we need to do as leaders is to ask why. Why are people being resistant? Often there are good reasons. They have questions. They're not being engaged. I've never heard anyone say that others are resistant to improvement, right? So a lot of times people are resistant to a change because they don't think it's going to be an improvement. So I think one way to try to bring the culture around, I try to encourage leaders, when you're sensing resistance, don't stop engaging with that person and write them off. That's when you need to really engage more deeply with the person. And I think it's not just a matter of telling them why they should change, but it's got to be more of an exchange, listening, and trying to bring people along. And it's the last point I'll make on this is I've been studying psychology All right, but I was saying, motivational interviewing, they point out the idea that even when change is positive, it is a natural step in the change process to go through a phase of resistance. And I think that's all the more reason to help people through that instead of just labeling them as being bad.
I think the more resistance that you're feeling or sensing probably means that you need to do more listening. I mean, that was the word that came out in all the words you were saying to me is listening, because the more that you can understand the persona, the place, just the experience of the frontline worker, the more you will be grounded in a similar base to then start working from that journey. There's one thing to say, hey, I'm going to pull you along, or worse, I'm going to whip you from behind to get you to move. Another thing is I'm going to join you arm in arm, and then when you're ready to walk, I'll be here ready to walk with you. And so I think there's a lot of resistance when people feel like they're being changed or being told they need to change.
Right. Yeah, and the motivational. Go ahead. Motivational interviewing would encourage us to draw out from people what their motivations are for change. So I think it's good when I think people move along. One level is we're telling people what to do, and then they're resistant. And I think there's another level where people say, well, we should explain the why. But I think even better is sort of trying to draw out from people what their motivations are. And if their motivations are wholly unaligned with the organization, I would say that that's a leadership challenge. Back to I think what Chuck and Tanisha was asking. I think culture change in a lot of ways starts at the top, with executives modeling behaviors that they want to see in the culture. So I think Chuck is right. They need to get out of their offices, get out of conference rooms. I think to your point a minute ago, I think we can start improving. We can use lean tools without the culture going from here to here. But I think there is a risk that if the culture doesn't progress, the tools will lose effectiveness. Continuous improvement momentum would be lost without kind of initial steps leading to broader culture change. What do you think on that?
There's another word that comes to mind as we're talking through this. To me, it's trust. And if you are a frontline worker and you don't trust your leadership, it's going to create a environment of that's going to become really difficult to get anything done. So I think it's really important for leadership to be as transparent as humanly possible. I don't know why leadership would want to hide anything at all, but the more transparent you can be, the more someone's going to trust you and understand your motivations are coming from a good place. And I think I heard a really great quote recently. Shingo apparently said that the order of importance for improvement is better, easier, faster, cheaper, in that order, right? And so I think that speaks volumes, because really the first orders of importance for improvement are all centered around the worker. And then when you have kind of established that, and then you can kind of really get people to start moving with change. And what's interesting is with the data that we see in KaiNexus, if you're just doing truly bottom-up improvements and you're not telling what people should be improving on, you're not making it thematic in any way, almost invariably staff satisfaction is one of the highest categories of improvements that come in. Then as time goes on, you start getting into kind of quality, safety, and cost, which I find that to be really interesting, that just kind of the natural order of selection of things lets that happen. And that won't happen unless you truly come from a good place as a leader, a proper place, and people will see right through you if you have ulterior motives on trying to change people versus trying to create a culture, or at least allow a culture to happen. Maybe that's the better way to say it.
Yeah, and I think trust is built through working on safety. Leaders focusing on the fundamentals, the things that matter to staff, is really important. Talking about resistance to change, there's another Shingo quote I was reminded of recently. Shigeo Shingo the late Shigeru Shingo, who is considered one of the creators of the Toyota production system, said 90% of resistance is cautionary. And I think that when employees are being cautious, that's all the more reason for leaders to continue the engagement rather than saying you're bad.
But I do think there is a role for leaders to, and I don't know a better word, maybe Mark, you have a better word for this, but sometimes I call myself the agitator. And I'm not agitating to kind of create, chaos and meanness. What I'm doing, I feel like sometimes I get brought in, let's say, on a marketing team or on a sales team or a CE team, and I just want to kind of stir things up to say, hey, there are no assumptions that we need to have here. Have we thought about this? Have we thought about that? Just because sometimes when someone says something that's, quote, stupid, if you will, even though I'm heavily putting that into quotes, it ends up kind of putting a different framing on something that you hadn't thought of before. Like, oh, I didn't even think about that in that way. And all of a sudden, sometimes when you turn the corner of the building, you're like, oh, I didn't realize that. That's right. Oh, and that was just a couple of feet away, but you couldn't get there until someone said something different. So I do think there's a role for the agitator, and you can see that with Paul Akers. I mean, he is like in your face, and he's kind of crazy and this and that. But what he's really doing is he's kind of agitating status quo to kind of like say, hey, what can we do and what can we filter out that's better?
I would say Paul is energetic. How's that?
Quite. Yeah. He had this. I saw this video. He's literally going around on one of those razor things that like your kids go around in because he's got to get from point A to point B quicker. I was like, that's a lot of energy.
Yeah. So let's segue. You mentioned transparency, and we had a question from Anju who asked, "Is it okay for a leader to apologize? Is it taken as a sign of weakness?" So I'll answer it simply and say yes, it's okay for a leader to apologize, and no, I don't think it's taken as a sign of weakness. I mean, there is, shall we say, sort of an older corporate style that sometimes bleeds into politics of saying, I cannot ever admit being wrong or making a mistake, and I think that just causes so many problems. I blogged about the idea years ago that it actually takes great strength and confidence for a leader to be humble and to listen to others and to admit a mistake. I think there's real strength in that, and I think employees will quickly see through false bravado or a leader who can't ever admit being wrong or can't ever find a reason to apologize. What do you think? I mean, I'm curious, in the medical realm even.
Yeah, no, I think that this is it's a great question. I think there was some intent behind the question because I think it's obvious that yes, I think people, when they apologize, they're more likable because they're more of a human versus attempting to be some kind of demigod or something along those lines. I will, and really just to be contrary, I will throw out a time when being the agitator, I think that it probably is a sign of weakness. I think, for example, someone that, let's say, inappropriately sexes or texts with the sexing thing, I don't know how they call that thing, and just does it over and over and over, but keeps apologizing afterwards, you're kind of like, hey, that is actually a sign of weakness, and I can't remember the politician or whatever that has that issue. But I think if you make a mistake, it was a genuine mistake, and it's not like something that you continually do, and you apologize. That is coming from a place of profound security and profound strength, and I think that's a great attribute as a leader.
Yeah, and you bring it back to workplace. I think if an apology is not a get out of jail free card. If a leader is constantly blaming employees and yelling at them for problems, and then apologizes, and then does the same thing again a couple of days later, the apology, there needs to be reflection and improvement. I think when I've seen leaders trying to change their approaches, and let's say it's a really rare occurrence when they jump to a conclusion or they throw out a solution instead of engaging the team. An apology of, I'm sorry, I'm sorry for what I did there. That and I think that's different than the the art of the non-apology. Like, I'm sorry if you were offended by that is less of an apology than I'm sorry for blaming the team for that problem. But I think in healthcare, it's interesting when you look at apologies. Doctors apologizing when there's an error. A lot of studies have shown that hospitals and doctors who sincerely apologize get sued less often, because I think people realize, we're all human, mistakes happen. I think it's when people are unwilling to admit a problem where it starts to spiral. I think the idea of, the cover-up is sometimes worse than the crime. The aftermath of a simple mistake can get people more upset if there's not an apology.
Yeah, and a little unrelated, but you brought up the kind of the medical, legal, and being a physician. I've taken classes on this. Part of orientation, sometimes part of our residency was related to this. And the statistic that I remember the most is just amazing. That it all has to do with your demeanor and your bedside manner, but some people are far more likely to be sued independent of whether or not a action they did could be attributable to a harm, versus people that do lots of actions that could be attributable harm, depending on their bedside manner, may never get sued. It's almost like an 8-to-1 relationship or something crazy to that effect. Like, really egregious acts get sued on 1 out of 8 times, and then if you look at lawsuits, almost 8 times more, there's really not anything, quote, wrong medically that was done. It was just that the people were kind of vile, abrasive, not human-esque doctors, and so but they end up getting sued a lot more in their life, or in their career, I should say. So they can actually see almost within the first year of someone leaving residency, their kind of lawsuit profile is very well established. That if you go through a couple of years and you're not going to get sued, you probably are going to go a long time without that. Most lawsuits, interestingly enough, have to do more with someone's got to pay for a whole bunch of medical bills than anything else, which I think is interesting as well. And then anyway, just we could have literally lectures and lectures and lectures on this as a separate topic within itself. So
sure, maybe you can do a webinar someday.
Oh, interesting.
We have a little bit more time on to plug our KaiNexus webinar series, the presentation webinars, which our next one, actually, I'll mention it, Thursday, October 26th, Jeff Roussel, our VP of Sales, is going to be doing a webinar. And next week on my blog, I'm going to be publishing a podcast that Jeff and I did, because Jeff is, I think, very uniquely positioned to talk about trends with lean and continuous improvement, because he talks to a lot of organizations and a lot of industries about the things they're struggling with. So I think that podcast, that webinar, that more presentation style webinar, hopefully will be of interest to people too.
Yeah, so what I found interesting, and when we realized that Jeff has probably talked to more organizations than most people in the lean world, because if you think about at KaiNexus, we have over 70 customers now, and you can kind of understand that in order to get one customer, you sometimes have to talk to 10 customers. So, I mean, just in those numbers itself, we estimate that Jeff may have had conversations with over 1,000 different companies over the last 4 years. And so it's really interesting to see the patterns and the trends. And I feel like we've really kind of put together a really nice story on kind of the traits and the hows and the whats, and so I'm really looking forward to that. Separate topic, and one that you may not be aware of, but I did a separate podcast that will get on the KaiNexus podcast series, Mark, about with my good friend and a local dermatologist here in Austin, Dr. Colby Evans. And Dr. Evans is, aside from being a thought leader and very well published, and also an industry leader in psoriasis, he has gotten very interested in drug pricing, and it was a fascinating conversation that we'll be putting also in a couple-part blog series that you should definitely check out, Mark. We should be getting that online here in the next couple of weeks. So maybe our next topic should be about malpractice. So
yeah. I would encourage people, also you can go to kainexus.com/podcasts to learn more about that. We've got a question that came from Mark. How do companies get hundreds or thousands of ideas from their employees annually? I would say, for one, leaders are actively engaging employees. They're asking them to point out problems, barriers, opportunities for improvement. They're asking employees what their ideas are that they might like to test. I mean, I think the biggest factor I've seen, it's not targets for everyone must do X number of improvements. It's not about incentives. It's about leaders engaging their people, tapping into intrinsic motivation. Back to what Greg mentioned, what you mentioned about Shingo, easier, better, faster, cheaper, questions like that. And it's really, I think it's that effort of working with people to help test and implement ideas, and then giving recognition more so than rewards. The more you help follow that pattern, the more that culture is going to build, and before you know it, you've got hundreds or thousands of ideas every year.
If you haven't read Daniel Pink's book Drive, highly recommend it. It gives a lot of social science and behavioral kind of cognition on intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation, and where all this comes from. And there's a great amount of knowledge you will get from that book that you can apply in a environment where you're doing continuous improvement. Number two is all companies are essentially made of humans. You know what I'm saying? I mean, so we're all kind of the same stock, if you will. Now, granted, I get it. Some companies will be able to get higher performing humans versus not. But if you look at the type of companies that are practicing the cultures of continuous improvement, that are what we would consider really great practitioners of lean, are on a great journey, they're all over the place. You can't say, well, they're all 5'8" and this and this and this. I mean, they are every shape and size, every industry in every country, and it just really shows that. I mean, this is you're tapping into some really core human instincts when you start engaging in these practices. So there's nothing magical about it. The issue is, and the reason why it's so hard is because you have to be disciplined. Leaders can't just say one time on January 1st, we want your ideas for the year. They have to ask it on January 1st and January 2nd and January, every single day. It just has to be part of the fabric of what they do. And when it starts becoming like that, you all of a sudden you're going to see just a huge amount of ideas come through from your frontline staff. Yeah.
Totally agree. Let's get in another question or two here. Diane asked, what's the best way to get a job in the process improvement Kaizen fields? So I think there could be a lot of questions behind the question here, so I'll try to answer something that might be helpful. I think one path, so I get a version of this question a lot. Involved with lean in a hospital. And so then, there's two paths or questions there. One is you've got people in healthcare who have no experience with lean. And a lot of times my advice to them is, even if they have to switch organizations, let's say if they're a nurse, they might not be able to immediately jump into a process improvement role someplace else, but maybe they can take their clinical experience to an organization that has a pre-existing lean culture, program, whatever you would call it, get involved in improvement projects, get some sort of formal training or certification if the organization does it, and then use that as a springboard into a full-time role. I think that the most challenging way, to get or probably the least effective way would be just, go and get there's nothing wrong with online education, but going and getting an online certification might not be enough to get a job. So I think at some point it's a question of how to get a foot in the door, getting some experience. And then there's the people with a lot of lean experience trying to get into healthcare. to do lean work in healthcare. Sadly, I see organizations still that have job posted that say healthcare experience required. When I think they could find people from the outside who would bring a fresh perspective and be very effective. So I mean, I think in a nutshell, my answer to Diane would be, reading, learning, education, things like that are important. But at some point, you've got to try to position yourself where you can get some experience, learn by doing, and maybe turn that into a full-time role.
That's crazy that these job postings say healthcare experience required, right? As if it's
it says required.
Right. I mean, to think it's like you're hiring for a process improvement type of role. You're not. I would get it if it's like you're looking for a surgeon.
Right.
Like okay,
be a surgeon.
But it'd almost be like telling a surgeon, "Oh, well, process improvement experience required." Huh? I mean, your improvement is improvement, so that's nuts to that would be a requirement.
Yeah. All right. So let me kind of wrap up. We had one other question here. What's the next conference that you plan on attending? Greg, you've got one. You made reference earlier to seeing Paul Akers. Maybe you can talk about that and what you're going to do.
So I just came back from AME. It was in Boston. It was really great. We were vendors there. This year we're exploring, having booths at different places. We've been attending the Lean Healthcare Summit every year. That's usually in June, and we're branching out as we're getting bigger. We have a bigger budget to do these things, and it was lots of fun getting exposed to. I mean, a lot of people know about us through our online presence. Obviously, the people that are on this call know about us, but it was just fun exposing other companies that aren't online, learning about this stuff to what we were doing. The keynotes were fantastic, and one of those was Paul Akers, and he was just a really dynamic speaker. And hearing his journey, I think, is a great journey because he really started from a place where he had a great company. It wasn't the story of he had a failing company and then found Lean and got it on the right track, but he had a great company that was super successful and found Lean and made an even better company. And so it just really shows that these principles are truly a quest for kind of always pursuing excellence, that excellence is unattainable, and it's just the act of the pursuit that brings us satisfaction in what we're doing. And so we did that last week, and this week, super fun, we are going to the Lean Construction Institute's conference out in Anaheim, which we'll have a booth at as well. Who knew, but we have a whole bunch of construction companies that are using KaiNexus because guess what? They want to improve as well. So what about you, Mark?
Yeah. So in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be attending an event called Lean Startup Week. I'm going to have an opportunity to give a presentation about managing metrics, reacting or not overreacting to variation in metrics. That's a topic I've done webinars for KaiNexus on before. But it's called the Lean Startup Conference. But the thing that's interesting is that over the years, there are more and more people from large companies there trying to learn how to be more innovative, more entrepreneurial. Eric's new book that's just out today, I had a chance to read it in advance. It's outstanding. It's called The Startup Way. So I would definitely recommend that book for people, I think, in large companies. There are stories in this book from GE, Toyota, large software companies that are trying to make entrepreneurship a process and a function. So I think that's a really interesting frontier. A lot of connections to continuous improvement and kind of corporate innovation on that scale. So I'm really looking forward to that conference. It's going to be November 2nd and 3rd in San Francisco.
What's interesting, Mark, is I don't think if you would have asked me 5 years ago, would you recommend for all people that are passionate about improvement to make sure they go to a conference every year? I would have thought that was a very important thing. But now that I've been doing this I've actually gone to these conferences. I really think that it's critical to get out of your Gemba, if you will, and go meet people that have different Gembas, cross-pollinate ideas. Do I think you need to go to one every other week like you do? No. I mean, you have a different role, Mark, than most people. But certainly, if you aren't going to a conference, pick some conference to go to and learn some stuff and be exposed to some areas that you hadn't, and that'll only make you more enriching, and it just gives you so much energy. And so next year here at KaiNexus, we're going to be making sure that all of our employees are either going to Gemba, one of our customers, or they're going to a conference. So I think that's a really great thing, and if you don't have budget for it, you should go secure that now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree with you. It's really important. And one thing I'll mention about the Lean Startup Week event, if you go to their website, leanstartup.co, they have a number of live video feed locations around the world. I've done this before in Dallas before I ever went and attended the event in person. It's free. You've got to go, they set up locations where there's going to be a number of people there. So it's not just you at your computer watching presentations. They're encouraging people to get together in at least small groups, watch the content, network, and talk during the breaks. So I would encourage people to go take a look at that. I think it's something very innovative that I wish more conferences.
Great. Thank you, Mark. I know we're having some audio connection issues, but I cannot believe that 30 minutes have gone by. We already, for our next one, we'll have the first couple questions, and we can't wait to gather more. It's always a pleasure to catch up with you, Mark, as well. So I always like to say there's no better day than today to improve. So get out there and practice continuous improvement.